Okay, students, I'm making this particular video, and it may be a little long because there are several things which I think you should know, and a few things which I think will help you. So we'll kind of hit on a few hints and tips along the way, but the video primarily is going to be about this week's discussion about classes. Now, I know that it also talks about structs, but the reality is that C# really has no need for structs and is planning eventually to just do away with them. So why are we doing away with structs? The object-oriented programming languages, which is C#, Java, and so forth, have really switched completely to classes because they can do much, much more. We don't want to bother with structs unless we're dealing with programming languages like C or maybe C++, but when we're dealing with object-oriented programming, we want to deal with more progressive capabilities. And object-oriented programming, and even with C++, we want to do things that will be more practical. Now, we'll touch on classes within this week, but we won't even begin to be discussing what classes are fully capable of. We spend the first 3 weeks of the .NET 2 course discussing all of the things that classes can do, and even then only really in the most fundamental ways. So I wanted to get you a basic, more real-world, practical way to see a couple of different ways that we utilize classes. So we'll create a new project here. And by the way, if we ever lose Windows Forms apps, you can go to C# here, Windows, makes it very easy, and desktop. Desktop is their euphemism for anything dealing with Windows Desktop, and Windows Forms app is the second one on this for reasons that doesn't really make sense to me, but okay. And then I'll create a program and I'll call it classes 1, and I have a reason for that in a minute, you'll see. And just leave the framework as 4.7.2. That's basically core. And we'll set it up and it'll start up here. Okay, so we have a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. So let's say that we're getting some information in, and I'm going to keep it relatively simple, but it could be more complicated. And as we know, we typically double click and we have submit. Again, naming these things makes it easy to find within the coding. And of course, this is very little coding at the moment, but now another one of the things that I do is that when I'm setting up things like strings, for instance, and I know that I'm going to get text in, like in this particular case, I had first name, I try to match these up because later on when you go to use them, it will be very easy to see how they match up. And that will be more obvious right now. So I have first num, and it says that, but I didn't put a prefix on it, so, and I misspelled it too. So let's say that I put a prefix on it. That indicates it's a string. So if I'm looking through a lot of code, I know that specifically this is a string. But it has more important detail. str, and it comes up quickly here because it's not, str is not a prefix for most commands. Okay, so, and you can see here that last name, serial number are there quickly, and all I had to type was 3 characters. Not only do I only have to type 3 characters, I can hit the tab key right here on the one that I want, and it types all of those characters. And then I can say equals, and remember that I had the text box, and I didn't name those. I should have named those because here's where things get interesting. Text box. Text first name. Text last name. And again, prefix, txt. Text serial num. So if I have first name, then I can do text, and you can see those are the ones that come up. And I can hit tab and not have to type that. And then I can do dot. Now if I do .t, the most common things that are going to come up are going to be the first couple of things in this, and I see text actually gets highlighted. I can hit tab again and then hit my semicolon. str, let's do last name, tab equals txt last name tab dot text tab So I'm hoping that you see that by doing this, you ultimately will save a lot of time typing when you're trying to put information in. Now, for something like this, you know, it becomes kind of, you know, can you bypass things? Can you do things? Yes, you can, but it's a good idea when you are collecting text from the user on a form to put it into a separate variable so that you don't accidentally mess up a input value. You put it into a separate variable, it becomes a processing variable, so that you don't have input being manipulated into some kind of output. Partially that's because if you change something that was input incorrectly, then it becomes harder to find where your error occurs. Does it mean that you're typing in more code? Well, yes and no. I mean, as I showed here, I typed str and it highlights the 3 things that I set up. When I type txt, that's not that much typing because I can hit tab there and it shows up that way. It's not that much extra typing on your part. It's just a little extra code that shows up in the editor. Okay, the compiler will sit there and it will stream all of that down into nothing practically. So, in the grand scheme of things, don't worry about how much code is here. Worry about the fact that you'll be able to debug it easier. Okay, so this is kind of what I wanted you to get used to here. Now, we're talking about classes. Now, the handout does a fair job about discussing classes, but it doesn't really tell you why we're suddenly getting into that. And it also tells you to kind of go here and say, class I'm just going to make up a name here, class John, and then to start a class so that you can do whatever. I'm not really a fan of that method. I mean, certainly it's valid, but I'm not really a fan of that method. I'm going to show you something that the compiler can do, and I'm going to show you sort of a beginning way to do it. There is another way to do things, and I don't want to get into that here because it's very more advanced. This item on your solution is your project name. And if you go over here and you right-click on your project name, you can say Add Class. And then you give your class name, and I'm going to say I'm going to call it employee, and I'm going to put CLS in front of it just because. Okay, so we do that, and I want you to note that over here in the solution that right here CLS employee is created and CLS employee is created here. So what am I going to do with this? Well, in the first place, it's important for you to know that normally anything that we add to this by default is private. And by private we mean nothing else except class employee can see it. Nothing. The idea behind this is that there are things that we want other people to see or other parts of the program to see. But there are things that we don't want it to see. Now, one of those type of situations is, let's say that we've got a loop variable for a for loop. The for loop creates an item for doing the loop, or a while loop. A while loop is probably a better example here. And you have a variable int x, say for instance. And we don't want x to have to be used only in this part of the program, and then you can't use it in any other part of the program. If you're working on a large project with, say, 60 people or whatever, you don't want to be the only person who gets to use X. You want to be able to use X in your part of the program, and Bob and Ted and everybody else in the thing, they want to be able to use X for these insignificant little parts like a while loop, just as anybody else. So things that are private, okay, they are only visible to your parts of your program. So that makes it pretty easy, because then if there are other parts, then we can deal with that. So whenever you have, let me go back to this, you'll notice that this says private. That means these variable names that I set up, they're only visible, they're only usable inside of here. Some of you have already run into this where it says not available in context. This is the context. They're only visible inside of here. Okay? We want you to understand that there is public stuff, which is visible to other parts of the program, and there is private stuff, which is only visible to this part of the program, these few lines. Okay, so these 6 lines, only visible inside button submit click. Now, I came over here and I wanted you to see this, and I have a class. And things inside of here are private, but the class itself is public. And by that I mean the name, class employee, is public. If it weren't, you wouldn't be able to see it anywhere else, and all of the stuff inside of here would be useless. So now I'm going to do something that seems really crazy. I'm going to take all of these 3 and I'm going to cut I'm going to do paste. Pasting them into here doesn't make them particularly useful. However, if I say public and then I go back to here, and then remember this was called class employee. If I say CLS, notice this comes up here again, tab, and I'm going to create a variable. I'm just going to call it emp here, but you probably should give it a better name, but it's already class employee for that particular thing. But class employee, when I say class here, this is a variable type. Okay, it's like string, it's like int, it's like double. It's a variable type. You are creating a variable type. But this particular variable type has these things in it. Now, I'll come back to what that means here in just a second. We say class employee emp equals new, and you see that gets highlighted immediately. Tab. parentheses here because there are things that a class can do, which I don't really want to go into here. It's something which we have to go into in .NET 2. Semicolon. Now, these things are still highlighted. They are part of class employee now. So we say emp dot. And you'll notice that that one got the squiggle goes away, and that means the error goes away. Okay, so what that means is these three things are part of class employee. And because they're public, they can be seen by Form 1 so long as we do this. Now, what is this? We call this instantiation. Hopefully I've spelled it right. Instantiation. Yeah. Okay. A class is a template. It's not an actual thing per se. It's a template. But when you do this, you are instantiating, you are making a real copy of the template for the code to use. Emp becomes an object variable. It's a variable of an object of the class employee. Now I know this is really mind-numbing at this particular juncture, but if you look at this in this particular fashion, it might help. We can go here and we can add any particular item that we want. We call these properties. They are things that are part of the class. Now I'm going to show you something, and it's going to kind of blow your mind a little because you've already been using this. When you click on one of these, and you'll notice over here this says properties. All of these things are defined like variables within this button item, this component that we dragged onto the desktop. It has properties, things that tell the parts of it how to work. Okay, so we're doing the same thing here. We're telling this that these are properties. Now, we can also add methods. And methods are functions that do specific things. Now, we can have functions within here that are private, that do whatever, okay? And that's what happens here. This is a class. We say it's a partial class because part of it is called Form 1, and that's what we add to it. And part of it is Form, which is stuck in something which we call initialize component. Don't ever mess with this, or your whole program could go completely bonkers and out of whack, and it might crash it completely forever. We added these properties to this particular class, and now we can do whatever we want to do with these particular things. We can create a public item for this we can do whatever we want. We can add public I'm just going to call it do this, just so you can understand I forgot to tell it. There. Now, and you can do whatever code. You can call it from I'm going to do something very simple, but it's not very helpful. I'm just going to show you that it can work, okay? And actually, let's make this a string. And yeah, it's going to complain here temporarily. Return hello world. Okay, so now it's going to stop complaining. Do this. Okay, so this is what we call a method. This does something. These store data, properties store data. This is a method, and methods do things. So if I go here and I say do this, okay, now this is going to collect something, so it needs something to collect from. So I'm going to put a variable up here, string variable. I'm just going to call it S. Should be more descriptive, but here, let's do this. Let's call it str message. And let's say it comes back and it says str message equals, and you can see that it does something, it comes back, and so you can see what it actually does. I'm going to do this, and again I tab there, you see that, dot, show, tab, str message, tab. Okay, so let's run this. Now I can put stuff in here, it's not a big deal one way or the other, it doesn't care. In week 5, I think it is, you'll be into doing data validation, checking to make sure data is what it should be. When I click submit, you see the hello world thing pop up. Okay, so this just calls this method and it says do this. Okay, now this only works because it's public. If it were not public, if it were private, you would get an error before you could even try to execute it. Okay, this doesn't mind that it's private, but this does. It doesn't know what it is if it's private, because even though emp is class employee, it doesn't see this because it's private. If it's going to be seen someplace else, if it needs to be seen, it must be public. So I'm thinking that we may need to have a couple of instances where we have some videos with this, or maybe I can get away with some screenshots. But I wanted you to know that there are things that you will find about this that are helpful. Now, just like the handout says, this this can do whatever. Okay, if I had given input that was hours worked and rate of pay, then I could go in here and I could take that information from those variables, and I could do a calculation with the method that says what is gross pay, okay, and then return the value for gross pay, and go back to this, and I could output that, and I could, if I had it on the form, I could output it to the form. Okay, but remember, unlike what I did accidentally before, do your form first. Fill out everything that you want to input, everything you want to output. Do that first, because once you've got all of those things on there, then you already know at least some of the names that you're going to be using, like text first name.text. And that's helpful not just because you know the names, but because you can sit there and you can type the names, and you can type them over and over again by saying, txt, and they come up. They come up on the list, and you can use whatever one you want. Hit tab, and dot, and text comes up, tab, and it's very easy to use them. Okay, so it saves you a ton of typing. And I put the things like str in front of variable names because it helps keep it straight. And if you're looking at a long program and maybe you do a conversion from the input string to a number using parse or using convert to, then so then if you were to say double dot convert to double rather, you could put dbl and whatever the variable name was equals, and convert to double and this particular field, and you'd know that by looking at the variable that although this one is text, that this one is a double, and it would be very easy to tell the difference in your code. What am I looking at? Am I looking at collecting something string from text? Am I looking at something where I'm converting something to a double from text? You want to be able to tell so that you don't have to look through 1,000 lines of code to find out, oh, I did this here, this converted the thing to a number. You don't want to look through 1,000 lines or 10,000 lines of code to try to find out what you've done. And when you're working with 60 other people, you definitely don't want to do it when something comes up and you're trying to match what your program, what your portion of the program does, and somebody else's part of the program does. You want to be able to know that if you're passing text or numbers to somebody else's portion of the code, that they'll match up with that person's inputs or outputs, and you want that to work.